Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Before we get started, I want to wish all the dads and fathers out there a very happy Father's Day, for this episode is coming out on Father's Day weekend. So happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. And quick shout out to my dad, who was, I would say, a pretty large inspiration for how I got not necessarily into being a software developer, but interested in computers and technology in general, since when I was growing up, he had a job doing like IT stuff, and I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And I had a dream that I would work for the same company that he did, and we'd work together. That obviously didn't happen, but I did end up getting into the IT, specifically software development, not necessarily IT, although I do IT stuff in my home lab, since I am my own sysadmin, of course, and occasionally break stuff and then have to fix things. But it definitely was an inspiration there. So happy Father's Day to my dad and all of the other dads out there. So let's start off this episode with some trivia, which we were not able to do last week because of just how jam-packed we were with all the WWDC coverage. Now, one thing I will say about that episode last week was, as I was going through that episode, I was like, man, I feel like I am just rushing through this. Yet the episode still ended up being like an hour and 20 minutes because just how much stuff Apple jammed into WWDC. I believe like 40-some minutes of which came from the Vision Pro headset. So if you did not catch the coverage we had here on the Dark Assassins podcast about WWDC, you can go listen to that after this episode. And while an hour and 20 minutes might seem long, the actual event, WWDC, was over 2 hours. So we basically cut WWDC in half, getting basically all the information and additional information regards specifically to some software development related stuff, which of course we have to kind of tailor for this podcast. So now that I have rambled and gone off on enough of a tangent, let's get back to trivia. So this week's trivia question is, what year did the United States Department of Defense declare TCP/IP as the standard for all military computer networking? So what was the year that the U.S. Department of Defense declared TCP/IP the standard for all military computer networking? That is your trivia question for the week. Now, we've talked a few times on this podcast about the interesting comings of with the old GitHub, Copilot, Microsoft, OpenAI, all of that drama going on. Well, there's a few new details that have come out. Allegedly, GitHub and Copilot is being accused of trying to vary Copilot's answers now to avoid copyright allegations. So, according to a complainant, they contend that the filter is essentially worthless because it only checks for exact matches and doesn't do anything to detect the output that has been slightly modified. So, like, you know, the classic, you copied it from Stack Overflow, but you don't want to make it seem like you copied it. So you change the I in the for loop to like an X or something, and then you change the variable name to something else, and bingo bango, it's code that you totally wrote yourself and didn't just copy from the internet. Now, I'm not sure if that's like all of what they're doing when they're trying to check for exact matches. But obviously, if you just changed a couple variable names around, that would fool just checking for an exact match. So, and it is kind of like the lowest level on the totem pole in regards to changing your answer. Of course, that old adage of, hey man, can I copy your homework? Yeah, sure, just try to make it too obvious that you copied it. Don't try to make it obvious. And of course, it's pretty darn obvious that that's what you did. So yeah, I'll have an article linked down in the show notes if you're interested in reading more about that. But let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, this one's going to be tailored more towards the software developers, mainly because I have another news story that kind of relates to it. But for all the software developers out there, don't put off fixing your bugs. So if you find a bug in your code, don't put off, getting a patch done to fix that bug, because it can come back to bite you in a pretty severe way. And the longer you go without fixing the bug, the more you can kind of forget about it, and it can come back with a vengeance later. And the reason I bring this up is because there was some reports coming out this week of a Russian ransomware gang called Clop that has been exploiting a security flaw in a software application called MoveIt, which is an application used by large corporations and some governments too, to share large files over the internet. So specifically, the government of Nova Scotia, which uses MoveIt, said that basically they use it to share files across departments, and they confirmed that they were affected by this attack, and they stated that some citizens' personal information may have been compromised. But in regards to the leak that Clop put out, they said that if you're a government, city, or police service, we erase all your data. So how nice of them to be polite and erase all the data. Now, obviously, I'm not, are they lying? Are they telling the truth? Who knows? But it is kind of funny, assuming it is true, that cyber criminals are more polite with your data than some corporations and governments out there that just love to harvest as much as they can and sit on it so they can know more and more and more about you. But here's the cyber gang, ransomware gang, supposedly erasing any and all data in regards to governments, cities, or police services, allegedly. You can, of course, take them at their word and come to your own conclusions. But my biggest question out of all of this is, if you're a government or a large corporation sharing files amongst departments, like in the case of the government of Nova Scotia, why are you doing that? Like, why are you using a tool on the internet to share files across your departments? I would think that you would have some kind of internal solution for that, whether it's some off the shelf solution that you just like self-host and do it internally, or you have some kind of network storage like a NAS or a SAN or some other kind of network-related storage that you can share files and data across other members of the organization. I just feel like it's better, not only from a security perspective, because your data is never leaving the organization at all. It's always staying internal. And two, I would think you'd have significantly faster transfer speeds because you don't have to go out to the internet. You can be doing it all internally on your local LAN. Now, maybe sure, if you're trying to transmit across like, some stretch of different distance, and like, a building, say you're in a corporate office in San Diego, and you're, trying to transfer, files to another department that's in San Antonio. Like, sure, you're obviously going to have to be going out to the broader internet, but still you could have it all like quote unquote internal through like VPNs and VLANs and all that kind of stuff to keep all the traffic not going out to the public internet. So not exactly sure why they would be using that rather than some internal tool, but I mean, what do I know? Now, one thing I do want to point out real quick, though, is according to MOVEit's website, the creator of it is called progress.com. They do mention that you can deploy it on-prem too. They have an on-prem infrastructure as a service or software as a service in the cloud solution. So I guess theoretically, if they were hosting this on-prem, that probably wouldn't have been an issue. But I would assume that in at least a decent amount of these cases, it was probably hosted in the cloud. So even though they do claim there is encryption for the file transferring, obviously if you have that forward facing to the public internet, any kind of vulnerabilities that are, exploitable in the application that are also exposed to the public internet would be able to be exploited by cyber attackers. But in this article that I'm referencing from TechCrunch, which I'll have linked down in the show notes also, researchers also report that Clop may have been exploiting this the vulnerability in MOVEit as far back as 2021. So if this vulnerability has literally been around for like 2 years, basically, yeah, that's not good. I mean, granted, this might there's a couple things that could have happened. One, it was just a vulnerability that just went completely unnoticed because whoever was testing it obviously didn't test all the edge cases, or they just thought it was a minor issue and it kind of got put in the backlog and then kind of slipped down the backlog and didn't seem like a high priority, so it kept slipping down the backlog, and then they get hacked, and okay, now we got to fix it. So according to the article, the vulnerability has been patched now, but yeah, it is kind of an oof when you have a vulnerability that potentially could have been exploited for basically 2 years. So yeah, software developers out there, make sure you're fixing your bugs as soon as you can. Don't be putting them off. And I guess also, too, is make sure you're thoroughly testing your code so you don't have an instance where you don't notice that a bug exists. Make sure you're always testing the edge cases. And an even better solution is get someone that has no idea how your code works and give it to them to play around with. Because if you give your code to someone that has no idea how it works and they still can't manage to break it, you definitely improved your testing suite rather than you just going through some predefined test cases, because chances are, because you're so ingrained in the code, there are going to be things that you're not necessarily thinking about because you're too busy focused on other things that cause problems. So you easily fix those, but then there's other things that you didn't necessarily think about that someone else just randomly trying to use your program might encounter that you didn't even think about. So yeah, making sure that you're always testing your code to find bugs, and when you do find bugs, you fix them quickly, even if they might not seem like that severe, will prevent users of your applications from potentially getting hacked. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, as far as nerdy stuff, I guess we can get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week, honestly, was a little light on the nerdy things. Now, followers of my blog will know that there was a new post this week. And if you recall from obviously not last week, but the week prior, I mentioned I was working on a blog post about the Xserve RAID. So that is now out. Pretty proud of that one. It is definitely a long read. It's not exactly something that you can breeze through pretty quickly. Although I guess there is a large section in there on how RAID works, and if you're already smart, I guess, in the tech sphere, and you already know how RAID works and don't need an explanation on it, you could, I guess, breeze past that section. But I think it's a pretty good read. It definitely was fun to play around with the Xserve RAID and, show how you can use it. I kind of took the angle of a couple different use cases. You obviously have the just plug and play use case, and then you also have the NAS or network attached storage use case where you can turn an Xserve RAID into a NAS. Now, one thing I will say that I was kind of surprised, a couple of things I guess that surprised me when I was working on this. One of them was that the fiber channel card that I got to put in my Mac Pro to be able to connect to the Xserve RAID, to my surprise, actually worked right out of the box. And the reason why I say I was surprised by that was because in macOS Ventura, which my Mac Pro, which is totally natively supported, it doesn't have any kind of settings in there at all, at least that I could find, for fiber channel. Now, if you go back to older versions of macOS, like when I was doing initial testing when I first got the fiber channel card, I was doing testing on, I believe, El Capitan. And that has like an actual setting in system preferences for fiber channel specifically. So when I was initially testing things, that's what I used. But then I thought, what the heck? Let's just see if we can't get it running on Ventura, because why not run the latest OS if you can? Like, if you can run the latest OS, might as well. So boot it up into Ventura, plug the fiber channel cables directly in, and wouldn't you know it, it pops up just like it would in El Cap, or just like plugging in USB would. And I was definitely happy to see that. And I guess I shouldn't be too surprised, since I believe Apple came out within the past little bit here. After WWDC, there were some questions on the Mac Pro, specifically what you can do with those PCI expansion slots. And in case you were wondering, GPUs seem to be totally 100% off the table, so you can't slap in a beefier GPU in there. You're pretty much stuck with whatever GPU you get that's built into your M2 Ultra. So either the base model, not really. It's pretty beefy. But the binned version, or the one with less GPU cores, or the full fat one with the 76. But one thing I believe they did mention is you can throw in like fiber channel cards, which obviously if you can use a fiber channel card in the latest Mac Pro, they're obviously going to still be supported in Mac OS. But of course, that I heard about that after I already tested it myself. But it is nice to see that it is still supported, so that wouldn't be an issue for you. Although one thing I did find that was kind of an issue is the RAID admin, which is the tool that's used to manage the Xserve RAID. So the RAID admin tool theoretically can work on any machine that has Java installed, because it's a Java application. The problem is, like when you try to access an old enterprise server that uses Java for the KVM feature, you'll know that those in the case of the IPMI features that use KVM and Java for that, you'll know that they use very ancient versions of Java that are not compatible with newer versions of Java, and the programs will crash. Same thing happens with the RAID admin tool because the security standards are not up to snuff. Now, one thing I was actually able to do was I was able to get RAID admin running in macOS Ventura with the latest version of Java. The problem was whenever I would try to actually do anything like connect to my Xserve RAID to manage it, it would just completely crash and not work. So I had to roll back to an older version. I ended up going back to macOS 10 Lion, which is 10.7. And that worked fine. Now, theoretically, you could go to an older version of Linux or Windows, theoretically, because, I mean, it's using Java. So as long as you had the right Java version, you should be able to use it on any operating system. And an even more secure way would be if I know there is a Docker container out there that allows you to access iDRAC 6, I believe, through a Docker container and VNC that way, so you don't have to install some ancient version of Java on your machine and have a security vulnerability. So if you wanted to, you could come up with, theoretically anyway, you could come up with a some kind of Docker containerized virtualization, some kind of solution that way, so you wouldn't have to have an old piece of hardware lying around with an ancient OS and version of Java running. You could just have it in some kind of containerized environment, and then you would only need to spin up that whenever you actually wanted to use the RAID admin tool, which in all honesty, you probably wouldn't really need to use it anyway, mainly because once you configure the Xserve RAID to your liking, unless you want to change some of the configuration settings, you never need to touch it. You can just plug into it or connect to it however you plan to do that, whether you're connecting directly to it through the fiber channel or you have it connected to another device via fiber channel and then are sharing that over the network to kind of act like a NAS solution. Really, once you set it up, you generally probably don't need to touch it again, kind of like a while back when we talked about setting up the Xserve's lights out management port. Once you kind of configure it the way you want it to, you really don't need to touch it again unless you want to like change some of the configuration settings that you couldn't change through just doing like IPMI tool commands through like a network connection. Because the thing with the Xserve is you can't directly call like IPMI tool and then do like a command, but what you can do is you can install IPMI tool through Homebrew, and then you can essentially connect to the Xserve's lights out management port on the Xserve like you would be connecting to a remote IPMI machine, if that makes sense. So imagine I have my MacBook Pro here. I could install Homebrew on there and connect to any one of my enterprise servers through the IPMI tool. I would just have to make sure I put in the IP address and the user for the IPMI account and then the password. So basically it's the same thing on the Xserve, but it's kind of you're remoting into yourself because the newer versions of macOS don't support built-in lights out management because there are no officially supported Macs that have lights out management, so there's really no need for Apple to build that into their software and operating system. So if you want to like do more hardcore configuring of the baseboard management controller, which kind of handles the lights out management on the Xserve, then you have to go back and actually use a version of macOS with IPMI tool natively that you can then just natively control the baseboard management controller. Now, I don't know, maybe sometime, I think it's highly unlikely that someone would come up with an integration for the Xserve on newer versions of macOS, but For a couple reasons, I don't see that happening. One, because who's using an Xserve? In all honesty, who's actually using an Xserve as a main server or a main machine? And two, because no one's using it, or very few people are using it, it's not supported. So there really isn't much like demand for it, number one, and two, like someone would have to have a real technical knowledge and probably really find a hacky way to get in and tap into it, and it would be such a massive undertaking for like not much payoff is basically what it boils down to. So theoretically, I think someone might be able to do it, but there wouldn't be much payoff for it, I don't think. So I personally, I don't see it happening, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen. There's already been a project out there where someone basically wrote a tool to so on the Xserve, there's lights on the front that on older versions of macOS, I believe, would allow you to see different statuses of it. And actually, if you look on the blog post, when I showed the Xserve RAID at the very end there, lighting up like a Christmas tree, those blue lights in the middle, like the activity lights, those are also, there's a similar version on the Xserve, and someone wrote a tool that can basically tap into those and basically use those to kind of show like CPU usage. So it's theoretical. I mean, the hardware is still there. It's just a matter of tapping into it is the tricky part. But yeah, that's the Xserve RAID. Definitely a fun project. I love me some Xserve stuff, which is funny because it's so impractical in so many ways, yet it's just so fun, in my opinion, all at the same time. Now, with that, let's kind of get into the bigger topic of the week, and that is what the heck is going on at Reddit. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is I kind of want to talk about APIs and how they work, because the reason why all this drama is going on with Reddit right now is in response to their API. So I guess first off, so I'm not speaking in a totally foreign language for everyone, an API is also known as an application programming interface. So we're all up on the I guess it's not technically an acronym, since I think acronym is something you say, but the abbreviation for the word application programming interface, aka API, that's what we're talking about. So basically, what's going on here is there was a protest organized on Reddit to basically turn all of these subreddits private for 48 hours over the costs of the API going up, which it's kind of dumb to give a protest like time limit like that, especially when you're talking about an online website that makes their money through traffic and ad revenue. So if they know that they're going to take a slight hit for 2 days and then be back to normal, I mean, they're not even going to bat an eye, right? Some ordinary gamers on YouTube, I think he said it best. He basically compared the 2-day protest to going on a hunger strike until you get hungry, which I think is a pretty good analogy there. Like, if you're just going on a hunger strike, but then you know that you're just going to quit when you get hungry, I mean, you're not really doing anything, right? You're not really accomplishing anything. So in the case for Reddit, in this case, if you're a company and you know that the protest is going to end and you're going to be back to making money within 48 hours, like obviously you're not going to bat an eye. You're not going to even have a single bead of sweat drip down your brow, because I mean you have no care in the world, because nothing's going to happen. So the change that they're doing for the API is they're now going to be charging 24 cents per 1,000 API calls, which honestly might not sound like a lot, especially if you're rarely using the API. But to put in context how much that 24 cents per 1,000 API calls adds up, one of the largest third-party Reddit clients, Apollo, stated, I believe in a tweet or something, that it would cost them $20 million a year just to keep the app running with that 24 cents per 1,000 API calls. So if you're basically creating a service that taps into an API, those API calls that you make add up pretty quickly. Now, if you're just making like a basic app for your personal use or something like that, I mean, you're probably not gonna, have to worry about that too much. But, a third-party client for a popular website like Reddit, I mean, that adds up really quick. So these API changes are, at least as of this recording, unless something changes between now and then, are supposed to take place on July 1st. So the Apollo Reddit client in this case said that they will be shutting down on June 30th. And that's got that, and the fact that they're charging for the API calls got a lot of people up in arms. Now, personally, I really don't use Reddit really at all. Like, occasionally I'll find myself on there. Like, if I'm trying to search up a solution to a problem, I might find myself on like a Reddit post or something and scroll through the comments, see if there's anything helpful. Occasionally I'll find myself on there looking at some pretty good programming memes. But yeah, generally I don't go on there. So personally for me, this isn't like end of the world. But it's still kind of making some news. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up was it was a perfect excuse to talk about another computer science related programming topic, that being APIs. So I guess to really understand why Reddit charging for their API is such a big deal, we kind of first have to understand what an API is and, why it's useful. So basically, in a nutshell, if you're only going to take away one thing from this entire episode, is basically all an API is a set of functions that allow you to perform certain actions. And that's basically it. So a common example would be like a weather API. You make function calls to, whether it's to whatever it is, probably a server somewhere, querying weather data, and in response, you get weather data. That's basically how it does. Basically, you make a request for something, so you don't actually have to write the code that handles getting that data, and then you use the data that was given to you. So there's a lot of different kinds of APIs. In the case of Reddit, they're basically allowing developers to pull data from their website, like pull forums, pull posts, pull comments, that kind of thing, and then kind of combine that into, and that's how they can create like different third-party apps by making a bunch of different API calls to gather a bunch of data and then funnel that into a nice interface for people. Now, other examples of APIs, OpenAI has an API that allows developers to tap into their large language model, ChatGPT, so people can do requests there. On a similar vein, Wolfram Alpha also has an API that allows people to send it like various language requests, math problems, a bunch of different things like that, and then it'll generate and return a response back to you. Apple also has plenty of APIs built into their software development kit, or SDK. They obviously have multiple SDKs for their various different platforms, all with their own APIs. And basically what this allows you to do is access different aspects of whatever the Apple device is, whether it's the iPhone, the Apple Watch, the iPad, the Mac, TV, whatever it is. It allows you to access different aspects of that without actually having to write the code to interface with those aspects. So a good example of this, I know I talked about on the podcast not a couple months ago, I guess, where I was trying to write iOS apps, but rather than writing, because I didn't really have an idea for an iOS app, I figured I can write like very, very small niche kind of one-use apps that kind of demonstrate the use of a certain tool or feature. So specifically in this case, I was talking about using biometrics through Touch ID and Face ID. So for that, I used Apple's local authentication API, which is built into their iOS SDK, which basically handles all of the handshakes and all the behind-the-scenes stuff needed to interact my app with the secure enclave on the Apple chip, the Apple Silicon chip, in order to access biometrics and, authenticate myself. So I didn't have to write any of that code. I literally just made an API call that, says authenticate, and it does all the stuff behind the scenes to handle all that back-end stuff, so I don't have to write the code myself. So APIs can be pretty darn powerful. Now, one thing I did mention there was an SDK, or a software development kit, which kind of sounds like an API, but they're different. And one of the big differences between an SDK and an API is an SDK generally contains multiple APIs as well as other tools. So one of the probably more common SDKs out there is the Java SDK. So if you want to do any kind of Java programming, you download the Java SDK, and then bundled with that comes a bunch of different APIs that can allow you to perform a bunch of various tasks, from system-related tasks, creating files, doing things at the system level, moving around files and directories and, all kinds of stuff, doing networking, all those APIs. So you don't actually have to write the code itself to interface. You just, call the function. But also built into the Java SDK is the compiler that's needed to actually, build your code into an executable that you can then run. So SDKs are a lot more than APIs, but they generally contain multiple APIs. So obviously, in this case, Reddit's API is not an SDK because you can't use Reddit's API to compile code, for instance, or tap into, hardware on a device or something like that. So when it comes to APIs, there are generally a couple different variants. One of the more common ones, in the case of Reddit for this case, is web-based APIs. Now, there's a few different kinds of web-based APIs, but I think one of the most common web-based APIs, and I think the one that most non-tech savvy people might have had at least have the highest chance of hearing before, is called the REST API, and that stands for Representational State Transfer API. So basically, how this works is it's a client-server type protocol, how it works. So basically, you as the client or developer reach out to the server and ask it for data. And then the server then responds to you with the current representation of whatever that data is in a standardized format. So basically what this means is, if we're going back to that weather example, you would reach out to the server and say, hey, what's the weather in Dallas, Texas? And it would respond back to you with maybe a JSON object or something, or an XML sheet with, the name of the city, maybe what the current temperature is, and maybe whatever. If you requested Fahrenheit, it would give you Fahrenheit. If you requested Celsius, it would give you the humidity, the wind chill, the wind speed, all the different various weather data in a structured format that you could then use in your code to do whatever you want to do with the weather data. So that's kind of an example of how it would work. So the way that REST APIs work is they're built on top of the HTTP, or the Hypertext Transport Protocol, to do all the request handling. So if you look at a REST API request, it looks very, very, very similar to a website URL. So because it's built on top of HTTP, this allows you to do a bunch of different HTTP-like requests. So you can do GET request, POST request, PUT request, and DELETE request. But by far, I would say the GET request is probably the most common, because that's what you're going to do if you're going to want to be querying data. And I think in most use cases for developers querying APIs, they're going to be doing GET requests. They're probably not going to be doing a whole lot of POST requests or DELETE requests or anything like that, unless they're like adding to the knowledge base or whatever of the API. Another thing that REST APIs are stateless, and basically what that means is every interaction is independent of each request and response, and all of the information that you need is included in that response. So basically what this means is every request that you make as the client is interpreted as a brand new ask from the server. So the server doesn't remember anything from past requests. So if you wanted to do a very privacy-oriented API, this would be one way to do it. Now, theoretically, this is, assuming that you're not like logging information about the people making requests to you, but in regards to like it doesn't remember, like if you asked what the weather in Dallas was, it's not going to remember that when you then go back and ask, hey, what's the weather in Minnesota? Now that's again not to say that the provider of said API isn't maybe logging some stats of like your IP address or your location or whatever about the when you make those various requests. But from the programmatic aspect, the behind the scenes function, there's no remembering of past requests kind of a thing. Another thing, because it's also built on HTTP, is it allows for caching. And the reason why this is super nice is if you have to do, if you're doing a bunch of different API calls, and there's always a few that you're always constantly making. If you can then cache that data so you have it on hand, so you don't have to make that API call every single time someone makes a request for that, that can greatly speed up the overall performance of your program. So if you're, for instance, creating a weather app, you probably don't need to reach out for the weather like every time, someone hits the refresh button if they're always constantly hitting refresh, because chances are the likelihood that the temperature is going to change between when I hit the refresh button now versus when I hit it 2 milliseconds ago is probably basically zero. So for certain instances, you could make a request, cache that request, have it stored in the cache, and then so you wouldn't have to be constantly going out and reaching out to the website that you're reaching out for the REST API. Now, some non-web-based versions are generally kind of in the form of the SDKs like we talked about, or some other kind of framework or library or some other thing of that nature. And basically, these are kind of collections of different APIs for different things. So, like graphics libraries and whatnot, like they have calls that you can make to tap into the GPU, like for example CUDA. It's how you do programming for NVIDIA GPUs. You're not doing like assembly code to manually move data from CPU memory to GPU memory and all that stuff. You're not doing any of that. You're using functions that are built in to the CUDA framework and toolkit to be able to do all that for you. So all you have to do is make, a CUDA mem copy or something, or CUDA malloc, and it does all that work for you. So you don't have to worry about doing all that low level, super complex stuff. You can just make a function call. And it's it's really important for anyone that's making a new piece of hardware or some kind of specialized piece of software to have an API for it, because this actually allows people to interact with it. Because if you want people to use your product or use your software or use your service or whatever, you want to make it easy for them, because if it's easy for them to use, they'll be more likely to use it. If they have to go out of their way to reverse engineer it just to be able to use it, they're probably not going to use it. So if you're nice and smart, if you do come up with a new piece of hardware or a new specialized piece of software, chances are you're probably not going to make everyone manually write the code to interact with it, and you're going to make some kind of API that they can then tap into in their code to be able to easily interface with whatever your program or hardware is. So ideally, you would have some kind of you'd probably make some kind of library for that, where you'd have like a header file. If you're doing some kind of like a C or C++ or Rust or something, you'd make some kind of like header file with the various functions, and then in the compiled library would be all the source code that allows those functions to tap into, and that's the header file itself would kind of be like the functions for the API, and then the library itself would be kind of all the meat and potatoes, if you will, of all the behind-the-scenes code that goes into handling, the interfacing with it. So rather than, John Doe over here having to do all the manual commands himself, he could just call like connect to hardware or something, and it would automatically connect for that as long as he passed in the right parameters, right? So that obviously would be one reason why you'd want to write an API if you're making a specialized piece of hardware or software. So as we've kind of laid out here, having an API is pretty crucial for making not only developers' lives easier, but also users' lives easier, because if the developers don't, write the software, there's going to be no users for it. And if the developers write a pretty terrible piece of software, the users aren't going to enjoy using the software. So if you make an API that makes the developers' lives easier to make a better piece of software, it'll then in turn make the users' lives easier and make them want to use the software, and everyone's happy. So taking this back to Reddit now, obviously Reddit is a company. They gotta make money. And whether you like it or not, it's their API, and they can do whatever the heck they want with it. If they want to go the Twitter route and charge money for it, that is totally their call, and they can definitely do that. Now, that's not to say they're not going to have some backlash for doing that, as we can clearly see by the protest going on, which I will say, while it was, I guess, originally only slated to be 48 hours, I believe there still are a large number of subreddits still protesting and kind of, I think they're trying to go indefinitely, but the number of subreddits, I believe, at least as of this recording, has dropped from the highs during the 48 hours. But anyway, back to the topic, I guess. I think the main reason I think that this is coming about is because they are planning on releasing an IPO. Basically, they're trying to go public, and obviously one thing that any publicly traded company has to worry about is the shareholders, and the shareholders want to make sure that you're raking in the big bucks. So an easy way to rake in some quick cash would be charge money for an API that you have, so whenever someone wants to use it and use your services, you can just easily make money that way. Now, I think one thing you could argue, because how prevalent third-party apps were and how, Apollo, we talked about Apollo, the big third-party Reddit client that I guess a lot of people liked. Obviously, a lot of people liked it. If it would cost them $20 million a year in order to keep it running at 24 cents per thousand API calls, that's a lot of API calls and a lot of users. So, I think people probably wouldn't be as up in arms about it if most people were using the first-party Reddit client, but that's obviously not the case because allegedly it's pretty terrible. Now, like I said, I don't really use Reddit. I don't have any Reddit client on my phone, so I can't really speak to any of this. But from what I've heard, the first-party app is not as good, and two, full of a bunch of ads and stuff, which makes sense, right? It's from Reddit. Reddit needs to make money. They make money through ads. And obviously if you go with the third party route, they might not be incentivized to make money through ads, so they can just make the API calls to get all the data and not have to give ads at all. So I think if the first party app was actually good and was, and the roles were switched where the majority of people use the Reddit app, the first party one, and they liked it a lot, I don't think you would be seeing this much backlash over the charging for the API if it didn't affect an app that a lot of people liked and used. So if the Reddit first-party app was actually good and actually had the vast majority of the market share, I really don't think that this would be an issue, because obviously if you don't have a major developer group, using your services, which is a large portion of your user base, them going under because they can't afford the money for the API. Not many users would, be in that group if their market share wasn't so large. So I still think there would be backlash, obviously, because I believe MKBHD on his podcast and I think on his YouTube videos kind of laid it out pretty good when he said basically to the effect of you can't really charge for something that you once gave away for free, which is a good point, right? Like if you're used to something or some service being free, then all of a sudden having to pay for it is kind of like a slap in the face, because you're like, I could used to get this for free. I didn't have to pay for it. Why are you making me pay for this now? So that is one thing, but I think the larger reason, like I said, that a lot of people aren't up in arms is because how many people are going to be affected with Apollo most likely going under assuming these prices actually go into effect July 1st and Apollo ceases operation, because a lot of people are no longer going to be able to use the app they like and they're going to be forced to something else. So yeah, I guess my message to Reddit is if you want to not make people as mad and still want to charge for your API, maybe make your app better so people won't be as mad, because if you make the best app, people are going to want to use your app. So if you make the best app, then you won't really have people needing to use your API, which I guess on the one hand would mean you make less money from people using your API, but then you don't have people mad at you for jacking up the price on the API so they can keep using their third-party app. I don't know. It's one of those like internet drama things that it's really fun to watch and sit back and eat your popcorn when you have absolutely no skin in the game. Like, I had the same opinion when Twitter was charging money and everyone was kind of all up in arms about, the Twitter Blue thing, charging $8 a month and the entire debacle going on there. And, everyone was, going crazy and were saying they were going to leave Twitter. which I don't think really ever happened because, people are addicted to social media these days. But, when you don't have any skin in the game, like I don't have Twitter, I don't go on Twitter, seeing everyone be all up in arms about it is kind of funny. Same thing with Reddit. I don't really use Reddit at all, don't really go on it, don't really use it. So seeing, the craze going on, kind of funny from the outsider perspective when you don't have any skin in the game. Now, if I was good, I would have planned a pretty smooth transition here into the trivia question, but alas, I do not, so we are just going to get into said trivia question. So this week's trivia question, as you'll recall, is what year did the United States Department of Defense declare TCP the standard for all military computer networking? Now, if you said 1985, you are unfortunately incorrect. It was 1982. So 1982 was the year that the Department of Defense declared TCP the standard for all military computer networking. And in the spirit of it being Father's Day weekend, for all the dads out there, even if you did get this question wrong, I'll still give you the points anyway, because it is your day after all. So once again, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. If you enjoyed, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share with a friend or family member who might be interested in learning about how APIs work and what they are and why they're so crucial. And if you have any questions about this episode or any comments or have any questions for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. As always, there is a link down in the show notes below for that. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.